Nirasya sarva sandeham akikritya sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam bhajami gurumishwaram. Itam Shri Radikan Prananatha Pada Sarojayo Yena Premanubhutyasha Dattam Tam Shri Gurum Bhaje Shri Govinda Pararavinda Marupananya Bilashojitan Purna Prema Rasotsavo Jalamano Vritti Prasannananan Shashvad Krishna Katha Mahamrita Payora Shomura Kedato Bande Bhagavatani Mananudavam Murdna Nipatyakshito Namah Shri Guru Krishnaya Nirupadi Kripa Krite Ya Shri Chaitanya Rupa Bhutanvan Prema Rasam Kalo Jayatam Surito Pangor Mama Mandamater Gati Matsarvasva Parambojo Radha Madana Mohano Adadana Dantoyer Yacheham Puna Puna Srimad Rupa Parambojo Dhuli Syam Janma Janmani Abhirapali Patiputra Kanta Dasya Bilashati Balashvavara Sri Rupa Chintamala Sapti Sangsto Matsvanta Durdanta Haichurastam Raganugami Bhajano Lasamanasanam Shri Radhaya Sahasara Smaratam Brajandhum Shri Rupa Parakamala Shrita Chetasame Chittam Satam Madhukari Yatu Pada Padme Bhaktirya Nikilarta Varga Jananiya Brahma Sakshat Krite Anandatishaya Prada Vishayajat Sukyat Vimuktiryaya Shri Radha Ramanam Param Bhaja Yugam Yasya Mahanashrayo Yakarya Vrajalokavad Gurutara Premnaiva Tasyai Namah Yaram Yanikila Ghashanga Shamani Shrutratritim Sangata Yasvadya Rasikai Sukabdi Janani Dhikarya Mukti Spriham Yadhyata Hridaye Vrajendra Tanuja Premamrita Syandini Saji Yadhari Bhakta Vrinda Mahita Dhanyeha Padyavali. By the grace of Shri Kali Yuga Pavana, the Svabhajana Vibhajana, Prayojana Avatar, Prema Purushottam, Karuna Mahasagar, Shri Gauranga Mahaprabhu, and his beloved Parshad, the crest jewel of Gaudiya Vaishnavacharyas, the fulfiller of his heart's desire, Sri Rupa Gosvami Pad. Again, today we continue our discussion of Padyavali. And in particular, we're here in the section on Bhagavad-dharma-tattva, specifically the subsection on jāti buddhi in regard to Vaiṣṇavas, or how a Vaishnava is understood to transcend the notion of caste. And along with that, we're analyzing how Vaishnavas were, in the view of Sri Sanatana Gosvami, Jiva Gosvami, Sri Darsami, Vishnu Chakravarti, how they existed within the Varnashram society, and how respect was shown by Vaishnavas to the twice-born, in particular Brāhmaṇas, and how due respect was enjoined to be shown also to the Vaishnavas, and how those different categories and different degrees of respect were ideally expressed. So, in the course of that discussion, we came last time to the subject that Sanatana Gosvami raises in the Hari Bhakti Vilas, in which there is a presentation of conflicting statements, or apparently conflicting statements, regarding eligibility to worship Shalagram Shilas. And he produces statements which say that one cannot do so if one is not a Brahmana or is not a twice-born, and other statements that say that provided someone has Vaiṣṇava Diksha, they can worship the Shalagram Śilā even if they're not a twice-born. So, in the course of discussing these statements, Sanatana Gosvami explains that there's no contradiction between them, that one either needs to have received the Upanayan Samskar or received Vaishnava Diksha, that one or the other is compulsory in order to be eligible to perform such puja. And in the course of discussing this, he also brings up again a verse that we discussed last time, where he states that a Vaishnava, by virtue of accepting Vaishnava Diksha or Vishnu Diksha, acquires the status of being a twice-born. So, what is the intended meaning in saying that a Vaishnava attains the status of a twice-born? And we discussed also last time where Sanatana Gosvami says that this means that the Vaishnava attains samya, or a likeness, or an equality with Vaishnavas. So, what is that equality? What is the intended sense? Sorry, one sec. Okay, so what is the intended sense of that equality? That's what we're diving into now. So, we'll look now at a passage from the Digdarshani-tika on the Hari Bhakti Vilas, where Sanatana Gosvami further discusses this subject, and what he says sheds light on what he intends to convey by this notion of equality, and what is the practical implication of saying that a Vaishnava, quote, attains twice-bornness, since, as we discussed last time, a Vaishnava was already explained to be more worshipable than a twice-born, with reference to the Bhagavatam and other verses, such as the statement of Prahlad Maharaj. So, if a Vaishnava is already more worshipable, more sinless, more pure, more meritorious than a twice-born, then what is conveyed by the idea that by becoming a Vaishnava you, quote, attain equality with the twice-born? If you're already above that, why is it so great to point out that you're, quote, equal to that? So what's the point of making that equation, or of speaking of that equality? That's what we're trying to determine based on statements that the Goswamis make. So, without further ado, we'll pick up from where we left off. So this is in the section in the Hari Bhakti Vilas regarding eligibility for Shalagram worship, and a statement, part of a long commentary that Sanatana Gosvami writes on this subject. So, Sri Sanatana Pad further explains this resolution to the apparent contradiction between statements governing eligibility for the worship of Shalagram Shilas in his commentary. And it is there that he again cites the verse from Tattva Sagar that speaks of human beings attaining twice-bornness, or dvijata, by means of Vaishnava Diksha. Because of the contradiction of the statement, quote, I am worshipable only by a Brahmana, with the aforecited statements of the great Puranas, it is this statement, quote, I am worshipable only by a Brahmana, it, meaning this statement, is to be considered fabricated by envious smartas. That's rare that you find Sanatana Goswami speaking to an ill motive of others. But as was noted in the previous class when we cited this verse, I put there as undetermined source. In other words, this statement that he quotes and says prohibits the performance of puja of Shalagram Shilas by women or Shudras, that the touch of the hand of a woman or the touch of a hand of a Shudra is like a lightning bolt upon the Lord. that statement actually can't be traced anywhere to any reliable text. So Sanatana Gosvami says here that this is a fabricated statement by envious smartas. In other words, by the twice born persons who are riveted upon the value of the path of karma and don't want to acknowledge the great merit of the path of bhakti. They have come up with statements like this that speak so as to negate the eligibility that those following the path of bhakti can attain for the worship of shalagram. So first of all, he tosses out one half of the argument, or one of the sides that attempts raise the contradiction, and says these statements aren't really reliable. But he goes on. Also, if with reasoning it were to be established along with a basis, that is, an acceptable justification, then in that case it should be determined that worship thereof, that is there's a typo, the shalagram śilā, is not to be done by non-Vaiṣṇava Shudras, and similar, that is, non-Vaiṣṇava women. And worship thereof is to be done by they who have accepted Viṣṇu Diksha. So essentially he's saying is, this statement that says that the non-twice born can't worship the shalagram śilā, this is not even a reliable statement. We don't need to be considered with it. But still, we'll play the, we don't have the phrase devil's advocate in Vaishnavism, but, so to speak, we'll entertain the possibility of the opposite anyway, just to be thorough. If, for whatever reason, someone did have a good reason for making this point, then we'll say that it just applies to non-Vaishnavas. It doesn't apply to those who've received Viṣṇu Diksha. Why not? Since those among Shudras and even outcasts who are Vaishnavas are certainly not called Shudras and so on. That is, since the Shastras do not refer to those who have become Vaishnavas when it speaks of, quote, Shudras and so on in general. Also, accordingly, in Naradiya Puran it is said, O king, when even a dog cooker is a Viṣṇu Bhakta, even a dog cooker who is a Viṣṇu Bhakta is more than, that is superior to a twice born. In Itihasa Samuchai, it is said, quote, one who sees a Bhakta of Bhagavan to be a Shudra, tribesman, or dog cooker, meaning outcast, because of commonality in caste, that is, because they might have been born in a family of such persons, certainly goes to Naraka. So here you have a statement directly parallel to the subject we're discussing here in the Padyavali. Our whole discussion in the Padyavali is saying that one who has jāti buddhi regarding a Vaishnava is a Naraki, or is situated in Naraka. And here you have this statement that one who sees a Bhakta of Bhagavan to be a Shudra or an outcast, because of commonality in caste, meaning because they might have been born in in a family of such persons, but if after birth they've taken to the path of bhakti, they've received Vaisṇava Diksha, they've become a Bhakta of Bhagavan, then to still regard them or to still consider them a Shudra or an outcast just because of their birth, that is, an ignorant mentality, or that leads to an unfavorable destination for the thinker. So, furthermore, equality with Brāhmaṇas, even on the part of Shudras and others, is very established by the power of Bhagavad-Diksha. So even Shudras and those of even lower caste, for example dog cookers, can attain equality with Brāhmaṇas by receiving Vaiṣṇava Diksha. Accordingly, in this regard, it has been said, quote, as by means of mercury, bell metal acquires goldness, so by means of Vaiṣṇava Diksha, the twice-bornness of human beings arises. Here, it is to be observed that this second citation of the statement in Tattva Sagar, that all human beings can attain the status of a twice-born, that is a Brahmana, by means of Vaiṣṇava Diksha, is evidently for the purpose of establishing the conclusion that those who have received Vaiṣṇava Diksha have acquired eligibility for worship of shalagram shilas, which is a form of worship, the eligibility for which is sometimes considered by some to be had only by the twice-born or only by Brāhmaṇas. Sri Sanatana Pad's intent in citing this verse is thus in no way for the purpose of enjoining that, I think that should be, those who received Vaiṣṇava Diksha can or should, his point is not enjoining that those who have received Vaiṣṇava Diksha can or should go and engage in rites outside the path of bhakti. That is, chanting of the Gayatri mantra, performance of Vedic yajna, and other aspects of the path of karma. Rather, his intent is to establish that anyone who has received Vaiṣṇava Diksha is eligible for worship of Shalagram Shilas, irrespective of their caste. So, again, if we look at this statement in context, why does Sanatana Gosvami say it? He's not saying a Vaishnava, someone who receives Diksha attains the status of a twice-born, and now they can go do a Vedic yajna. Now they can go perform these karmic rites. That's not what he's saying. He's saying they've attained the status of a twice-born, so what can they do? They can worship Shalagram. They can do something that's integral to the path of bhakti, but is thought by some to be only something that the twice-born are eligible for. So they've attained twice-bornness. They've attained that eligibility. This is the only point he's trying to say. So if we then derive from this statement that Vaishnavas should now go and engage in these rites from the path of karma, that's not at all what Sanatana Gosvami is trying to convey by citing this verse. Furthermore, hypothetically speaking, if it were Sri Sanatana Gosvami's intent that those who receive Vaishnava Diksha should also thereafter receive the Upanayan Sanskar and engage in chanting of the Gayatri mantra and performance of Vedic yajna, then he would certainly have given guidelines and procedures for these practices in his comprehensive Smriti text, Hari Bhakti Vilas. The utter absence of any injunction for those who have received Vaishnava Diksha to also subsequently receive the Upanayan Sanskar, and the utter absence of any explanation of how the Upanayan Sanskar is to be administered, affirm that Sri Sanatana Pad in no way intends that the aforecited statement from Tattva Sagar be considered an injunction, promotion, or allowance for persons of all different castes who receive Vaishnava Diksha to also receive the second and third births, accepted only by persons of the three upper varnas who follow the path of karma. Sri Sanatana Pad's intent in regard to the notion of an acquired equality between Dikshita Vaishnavas and Brāhmaṇas can be further affirmed by reference to the commentaries on the statement of Devahuti to Bhagavan Kapila in Srimad Bhagavatam, the first of which he also cited as a reference on this subject in the Digdarshani-tika on Hari Bhakti Vilas 455. So now we come back to this verse about the Soma Yaga, or about one who's, having taken the name, becomes eligible to perform the savana. And now we're going to look at 4 or 5 different commentaries on this verse. So bear with the technicality, but there's some significant points which can reflect or help us understand the intent of the Goswamis about what they would consider the sadachar, or the established proper etiquette for those who follow their teachings. So, for probably the rest of the class, we'll be going through the commentaries on this verse. So again, we'll look at, it's actually a pair of verses, and then we'll look in detail at how they're explained. So, O Bhagavan, by hearing and repeating whose name, by bowing down to whom, and by even occasionally remembering whom, even a dog-eater immediately becomes eligible for savana. What more occurs by having the sight of you? How astonishing! A dog cooker on the tip of whose tongue your name is present is thus highly honorable. Those who take your name have undergone austerity, conducted sacrifices, bathed in all the tīrthas, become noble, and studied the Veda. Elaborating on Sri Samipad's commentary on the first of these verses, Sri Jiva offers the following initial explanation of the verse in his Krama-sandarbha-tika. Bhakti Sandarbha and, in his Krama-sandarbha-tika, in Bhakti Sandarbha, and in the Durgama Samgamani Tika on Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu 1-221. So in other words, Jiva Goswami replicates more or less the same general explanation in 3 different places where he cites or discusses this verse. So this is as follows. Quote, and this gets a bit technical, he gets into some grammatical matters here, so we've got technical rules of ritual, we've got technical rules of grammar, we've got all the hermeneutical tricks, so to speak, getting pulled out and put into play here. So, being a dog eater, or shvadatva, so this refers to the Nyayika style of things, where a quality is spoken of in the abstract. So, here he's speaking of shvadata, a little bit like how in classical examples they talk of gatatva or nilatva, that, the quality of, quote, blueness is found in a blue lotus, or redness is found in a red rose, or something like this. So then you define what are these qualities, so to speak, and then you speak about objects as substratums of qualities. This is kind of the essential breakdown of how things get analyzed from a Nyayika perspective. So here he's coming to, there's a mention in this verse of a dog eater or an outcast person. So shva da. So shva means a dog, and ada means to consume, as we'll see, or to eat. So shva da means dog eater. So, quote, dog eaterness. if you put the twa, the affix at the end to create the sense of an abstract quality. So the state of being, or, quote, being an eater of dog. What does this word, being an eater of dog, mean? So he says, being a dog eater here refers specifically to belonging to a particular caste of dog eaters. In other words, belonging to a family or a class of people who are accustomed to this type of behavior. So he explains, being a dog eater here refers specifically to belonging to a particular caste of dog eaters, because of indication by the word dog eater shada of that custom of habitually eating dog meat, on account of the usage of the present tense in the etymology of the word dog eater shada, quote, one who eats dog, as also is understood in the case of the word kravyada, which means a carnivore, or literally flesh eater. In the hypothetical case of an intention referring to atonement by means of hearing and repeating Bhagavan's name, bowing down to him, or remembering him, in regard to occasional consumption of dog meat, however, the past tense would be used in the etymology of the word chosen to refer to an occasional consumer of dog meat, rather than the present tense, which is the standard well-established sense used in the etymology of the word dog eater. So what he's saying is that you could speak of someone who is, let's say, this is not a pleasant example, but like a murderer. The most, classically speaking, the most horrendous act someone can commit. So usually, because people don't manage to commit this act too many times, most of the time when you speak of a murderer, you mean someone who has committed murder, meaning maybe once, or maybe they performed a mass killing. Again, sorry for the bad example, but this is just what comes to my mind. So a, quote, murderer, or one who causes death, in that sense, the cultural understanding, or the most likely understanding that you get from that word, is not someone who murders people on a daily basis, because that seldom ever exists, but rather a, quote, murderer is more likely someone who's been convicted of committing a murder. So the, so to speak, unspoken understanding, or the unspoken implication of saying that someone is a murderer means the way we would understand it is that they've done it once in the past, or they've done it on occasion in the past, but not that it's something that they're doing daily or habitually on a regular basis. That is usually we would refer to someone like a, quote, serial killer or something like this. So anyway, sorry for the tamasic examples, but what Jiva Gosvami is saying here in this case of this word dog eater is essentially the opposite. That when people hear the word dog eater, they don't just think, oh, someone who ate dog meat once in their life. Just as when we see, I guess I should have used this example, when we say a meat eater, we don't think of that as someone who ate meat once. If you kill an animal and eat it once, we don't usually call you a meat eater. We would just call you someone who did something, necessary in an emergency or something. But, if you can kill a human being, then we call you a murderer just because you did it once. So anyway, sorry for the extended explanation. The point is simply that the word dog eater here, according to him, doesn't refer to just someone who did this once, but rather to the caste of people that is called this name because they have the habitual practice of doing this activity. So it's not even so much about someone who is even eating dog meat or not eating dog meat, as it is about referring to the group of people or a person born in a family of people that are known to habitually have that custom. Essentially, it's just trying to talk about an outcast or a person born in a very low caste, more so than it is specifically about the activity of eating dog meat. It's because those who are outside of the upper varnas or even the Shudra varna are known to typically do that they're then referred to by that activity. But in many cases, when they're called a, quote, dog eater, what you're simply saying is that they're not a part of the four varnas, more so than you're literally trying to talk about the fact that they eat dog meat. So this is the subtle distinction he's bringing out here. So now, having established that, he says that, quote, and that supposedly intended meaning of one who has only on some occasion eaten dog meat rather than one who habitually eats dog meat, as a member of a caste of persons who regularly do so, is contradicted by the principle, quote, conventional meaning, ruddhi, supersedes etymological meaning. That is, the well-known convention of the word dog eater is a person who belongs to a caste of people who habitually eat dog meat, and not a person who has only on occasion eaten dog meat. Thus, there is no intention in the verse under discussion to refer only to someone who has only on occasion eaten dog meat, and rather only an intention to refer to a member of a low caste who habitually does so, since both the etymological and conventional meanings of the word dog eater convey this meaning specifically. Therefore, quote, dog cooker, sopacha, was stated to be the meaning of the word dog eater by the commentator, namely Sri Samipad. That is, therefore, Sri Samipad interpreted the word dog eater to refer to a dog cooker, which is a term that is also well known to refer by convention primarily to a low caste of persons who are so named because of their habit of cooking and eating dog meat. So this is another hermeneutical convention which says that the conventional meaning overrides the etymological meaning. So sometimes words acquire a meaning of their own, so to speak, or they become used in society in a particular way, where when you hear about them, they evoke a particular sense or a particular meaning, even though that might not have been the original meaning or the original usage of the word, and that prominent conventional meaning becomes, the way that it's understood. And then if you use the word simply to speak of the of the etymological meaning, someone either might not get what you said, or what you said might sound awkward or strange. For example, I don't know, one example comes to my mind, like in English, you have the word gay, which in earlier centuries just meant someone who's happy. So you can find in, even early 20th century literature, the boys were gay as they went to the park or something, just means that they were happy. But nowadays, it's become to refer as a term for those who are homosexual. So if you use the word and you're only trying to talk about someone who's happy, you might end up in an awkward situation if you use it referring to its etymological or its original meaning, more so than the acquired meaning that it's come to. So therefore, there's this principle that convention overrides etymology, or the conventional meaning that people are most likely to take from what you say. You better be careful. You better mind that when you use the word. So anyway, this is what he's referring to. So why are we going into all this technicality about the etymology of this word? Because it comes up later and it matters later when he actually comes to make a significant point of interpretation about the verse. So, as I said, this is very technical, getting into minutia, but anyway, we'll go through it. So now let's look at what he says further in the Krama-sandarbha. Quote, the statement in the verse that even a dog-eater, quote, immediately becomes eligible for savana, sadhya savanaya kalpate, is akin to the following statement in Padma Puran. Quote, one by whom the two syllables Hari are uttered, even once, becomes of bound girdle. So this is I'm just putting it literally, but it's an idiom, classical Sanskrit idiom, which means loosely saddled up and ready for moving towards moksha. So what he wants to say is anyone who even once says the name Hari, they're on their way to get moksha. They're, so to speak, like in the saddle and, about to take off, so to speak. In this regard, that is in regard to the statement in the verse that even a dog-eater immediately becomes eligible for savana, quote, he becomes one by whom the beginning in regard to eligibility is attained is the meaning. Okay, now here Jiva Goswami is getting particular. So the verse says that one acquires eligibility for savana. So what does it mean that he acquires the eligibility? Does that mean he acquires it in full? Here Jiva Goswami says, no. It means that the process by which one becomes eligible has now been initiated. Or he's begun, the process that can result in him being eligible has now started. This is how he's interpreting it. And he explains why. That is, it is not that he attains eligibility to perform savana in full, but rather that he has now commenced the process by which one becomes fully eligible for that. Only in another birth thereafter. Okay, so after his present birth in a caste of dog-eaters, shall he attain twice-bornness. That is, only after he takes birth in a family of one of the three upper varnas, the Brahmana, Kshatriya, or Vaishya, and undergoes the requisite samskaras, shall he receive the Upanayan samskar, that is, initiation into the Brahma Gayatri mantra, and investiture with the sacred thread, and thereby become a twice-born, and then in full a bearer of eligibility, or adhikari, for that is, for performance of the savana, the samayagya, and so on. That is, in other rites that only the twice-born are eligible to perform. This is the purport. So here what Jiva Goswami is saying is that the Bhagavatam is saying, the name of Hari touched your tongue, now you can do a savana, now you can do the somayaga. So he's saying, wait a minute here, does that literally mean that the person can now sit next to the fire and conduct the yajna? Jiva Goswami says, no. It means that the process of purification from sin that will result in you becoming fully eligible to do that has now started. In other words, now you've been purified of sin. But he specifies, quote, only in another birth thereafter. In other words, but to actually perform the yajna, you're going to need to be reborn, and then in the next birth in which you're eligible, you're going to need to get the necessary samskaras, and then you can actually do the yajna. So you've purified yourself of the sin that resulted in you being born not in one of those upper varnas. So now that sin is gone. So now in your next life, you can be born in one of those varnas, and then you can get the samskaras, and then you can do the yajna. This is how he's interpreting it. Not that, snap, now the name came on your tongue, now you can walk over and do the yajna right now. This is not his viewpoint. So Sri Jiva Pod goes into further detail in this regard in his Durgama Sangamani-tika. So now we look at another place where he gives a similar explanation. Quote, consequently, furthermore, his, that is such a dog-eater's, attainment of merit productive of caste status, eligible for performance of savana, that is attainment of merit productive of being born in the Brahmana, Kshatriya or Vaishya Jāti, preceded by the destruction of the commenced sin causative of the commencement of his low caste status. That is, his having been born in a low caste of dog-eaters that is unfavorable in regard to eligibility for savana, that is a cause of non-eligibility for savana, indeed immediately as a result of one act of bhakti among those mentioned in the verse, of hearing Bhagavan's name and so on, is taught in the verse under discussion, because of the requirement of the Savitra birth. That is, the second birth accomplished through the rite of initiation into the Savitra mantra, that is the Gayatri mantra, and the investiture with a sacred thread whereby one attains the status of a twice-born, which is the cause of rightful caste status, that is eligible caste status, for performance of savana, even in the absence of low caste status in the case of Brahmana's seminal birth. That is, even in the case of Brahmanas who have taken birth in a family that is not of low caste status, meaning that it is not outside the three upper varnas and thus has no low caste status, that is, an eligible caste status for the performance of Somayaga, meaning, since persons born in a Brahmana families only become fully eligible to perform the savana rite by means of becoming twice-born, through the second birth accomplished through the rite of initiation into the Savitra mantra and investiture with the sacred thread, the statement in the verse that a dog-eater becomes eligible for savana by means of bhakti should be understood to mean that a dog cooker thereby becomes purified of the commenced or prarabdha sin that resulted in their low caste birth and disqualification for performance of savana, and attains the merit that leads to one taking birth in a caste that is eligible for becoming a twice-born by means of the rite of initiation into the Savitra mantra and investiture with the sacred thread, and thereby performing savana. Okay, sorry. I know might sound a little bit redundant, but what he's saying is that you're born in an upper varna or you're born in a low caste varna because of some type of merit or dismerit in your past actions. So if someone somehow hears the name of Bhagavan, bows to Bhagavan, or does these other acts of bhakti, that power of bhakti cancellizes the demerit that caused them to be born in a non-eligible caste or a non-eligible birth, and can also grant them the merit or the punya that will result in them next becoming born in a family that is eligible to perform this rite. So bhakti has the power to cancel sin or pap and produce merit or punya, such that one can then enter the track, so to speak, of getting raised in such a family, receiving the sacraments or samskaras that are relevant, and then, according to the injunctions of the Shastra, acquire the full status of eligibility and perform this yajna. So what Jiva Goswami is saying is that when the Bhagavatam simply says, you bow down to Bhagavan and now you can conduct a Soma Yaga, it doesn't literally mean that you can actually go do that. It means now you've been purified of the demerit that caused you to receive a non-eligible birth, and you've acquired the merit that will result in you getting an eligible birth, and then once that eligible birth is actually taken, you'll get the chance to receive the samskaras and then conduct the yajna. So he's applying the meaning of the statement to the injunctions that govern the way the society and the process of training works. And he's saying that you're now qualified to perform savana means now you'll enter the track, go through the process, and get to eventually do that. And obviously the implied sense is if someone should so want, because this statement is just being made about anybody. It's not stated specifically in reference to someone only following the path of bhakti. It's just praising the power of the acts of bhakti, whomever may so perform them. So, as we've said, persons who are already following the path of bhakti, they don't even want to go and perform a soma yaga anyway. It has nothing to do with the path of bhakti. It has no benefit for the path of bhakti. There's no point. So it's not that they actually will, but for the sake of understanding the power of bhakti to purify sin and cause merit and so forth, these statements are made, and they may be of sound recognition of value to those who follow the karma marg. So this is some broader context, but what's significant specifically in this point is that in Jiva Goswami's view, in order to actually perform a soma yaga, you have to be born again in a family of kshatriyas, vaishyas, or brahmanas. You can't be born in an outcast family and then just by engaging in acts of bhakti, then go and receive this sanskar and go and conduct this yagya. This is not his view. Now, third commentary, in the Bhakti Sandarbha, he adds the following. Eligibility in this regard, that is, the verse's statements that even a dog eater becomes eligible to perform savana, however, refers only to the termination of the commenced sin that is causative of attaining the state of a dog cooker, that is causative of being born in the dog cooker caste. For the sake of performing savana, however, possessing other qualities is certainly also required, just as there is a requirement of a birth based on savitra diksha, that is, the birth accomplished by means of the rite of initiation into the savitra diksha mantra, that is, the Gayatri mantra, and the investiture with a sacred thread. Even for Brahmana boys who have the eligibility for performance of savana, of a seminal birth in a family of Brahmanas, for the sake of attaining the right conduct, or sadachar, required for performance of savana, the cause of which is the savitra birth, and so on. So what he's saying is that even a person born in a Brahmin family can't just go perform a soma yaga unless they have the upanayan sanskar. So now if some outcast who doesn't have the upanayan sanskar once chants the holy name, they can't go perform the yagya. What that means is that now they're purified of the demerit that resulted in their ineligible birth. But even like an ordinary person who's born, or a person born in those other varnas, they're also not eligible to perform the savana unless they have the upanayana. So they need the upanayana. But because they weren't born in those families, they're not eligible for the upanayana in this birth. Therefore, they're born again, then they do upanayana, then they perform the yagya. This is his point. Thus, for him, that is, for a dog cooker who has not been born in a Brahmin family and not become a twice born by means of the savitra birth, engagement in savana is not appropriate. In other words, therefore, in the name of this verse in the Bhagavatam, someone should not go and start trying to conduct Vedic yagyas. This is not appropriate. This is going against the injunctions that govern those processes. Therefore, and now this is the key point, the intention is only respectability and not literally possession of full eligibility for performance of savana. So then you might say, well, if the verse says that they're eligible to perform savana, but they can't actually do so and they have to be born again, then it's like, what does that even mean? So he's saying, this is what it means. It means that they should be shown respect like a person who performs savana. In other words, they should be respected as a sinless, highly honorable person, the way a brahmana who does these yagyas is, even though they were born as an outcast. So the eligibility that they acquire implies that they require a status of respectability, but not literal entitlement or literal license to go and perform that activity. This is Jiva Goswami's point. So what is then the equality that the person who does an act of bhakti attains with the twice-born? It's an equality of respectability, not an equality of literal practicality. In other words, not that they can literally go and do the same activities that those Brahmanas do, or that they can literally receive the Upanayan Sanskar. That's not Jiva Goswami's view. Rather, they receive respectability that those persons have. So he says, therefore, the intention is only respectability. Intending this, it was also said by the commentator, namely Sri Samipad, quote, by this statement that a dog hooker becomes eligible to perform the Soma Yagya, respectability is indicated. That is, the statement is not meant to be taken literally and imply that a dog hooker can or should actually attempt to learn and conduct a Soma Yaga. So what is Jiva Goswami doing here? He's just following Sridhar Swami. This isn't even Jiva Goswami's own interpretation. This is actually Sridhar Swami's interpretation, and he's repeating that, and he's following that. So according to Sridhar Swami, as well as Jiva Goswami, that you, quote, attain eligibility for Soma Yaga really means you attain respectability by virtue of being purified of sin. But not that you literally go and start conducting any yagyas or getting an Upanayan Sanskar in this birth. In these passages, it is clearly evident that Sri Jivapad's interpretation of the significance of someone, quote, immediately becoming eligible for savana. So now, you might object, right, that the Bhagavatam itself uses the word sadhya, immediately. You might say, immediately eligible, that means eligible in this birth. So even though the Bhagavatam says immediately, and you might be inclined to read it that way, that's not how Samipad read it, and that's not how Jiva Goswami have read it. So he's therefore giving all this technical analysis. So it's clearly evident that Jiva Goswami's interpretation of the significance of someone, quote, immediately becoming eligible for savana is principally derived from Sri Samipad's interpretation that the eligibility said to be attained here is not actually full practical eligibility to perform savana, but rather the attainment of the respectability of someone who does perform savana. Meaning, it is the attainment of the respectability of a twice-born that is brought about by, like the twice-born being free from past sin, that results in one being born in a family of persons who are ineligible to perform savana. Sri Chakravartipad also gives this same interpretation in his Sarta-darshini-tika on this verse. So Chakravartipad accepts this explanation when he comments on this in his Bhagavatam commentary by saying, quote, even a dog eater, that is, even a dog cooker, indeed immediately becomes eligible for savana, that is, for performing the Soma Yaga, meaning he becomes worthy of respect like a Brahmana who is a performer of the Soma Yaga. So the immediacy then is that even in this life, when he was given this low birth, still now in this life, immediately by the power of the name of Bhagavan or by the power of bhakti, they attain this respectability. This is essentially how Samipad, Jivapad, and now Chakravartipad in this case are interpreting this point. This same line of thinking given here by Sri Samipad, Sri Jivapad, and Sri Chakravartipad can also be applied to the aforecited verse of the Tattva Sagar, which said that by means of Vaiṣṇava Diksha, one attains the status of a twice-born, that is a Brahmana. By means of Vaiṣṇava Diksha, one attains equality with a Brahmana in the sense of respectability and sinlessness of a Brahmana. As Brahmanas are worthy of special respect and regarded as free from the sins that cause one to receive a birth outside the three upper Varnas, so too are Vaiṣṇavas to be regarded as free from such sin and worthy of respect accordingly. So this is, in essence, the point in the mention that Sanatana Gosvami gives of this idea that a Vaishnava, quote, attains the status of a twice-born. He just means the Vaishnava should be respected as, meritorious, as sinless, as honorable, like a Brahmana is, like a twice-born is. Doesn't mean the Vaishnava is not more than that. The Vaishnava is actually more than that. But this much can be recognized, that he's as pure, as, even a person of higher birth. So essentially, bhakti has the power to bring people the respectability that people of quote-unquote higher birth have. This therefore is showing one of the great powers or benefits of bhakti. Sri Rupa cites this verse that we're talking about, Bhagavatam 3.33.6 in Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, specifically for the purpose of illustrating the principle that bhakti has the power to destroy commenced sin, or prarabdha pap, meaning that bhakti has the power to counteract even the specific set of consequences for one's sinful actions in past lives that have been allocated to be undergone by a Jiva Atma in their present term of embodiment. He explains how this verse 3.33.6 affirms this as follows. So Rupa Goswami writes his own verse in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu to explain why he quoted this verse, or what is the principle to be drawn from this verse. So he says, Durjatir eva savanayogyatve karanam matam durjatarambakam papam yatsyat parabdam eva tat. A low caste specifically is considered the cause in regard to ineligibility for savana. That sin which is causative of the onset of having a low caste shall certainly be considered commenced or prarabdha sin. So he wants to show that bhakti can destroy prarabdha sin. So the sin that causes the birth that you take is definitely prarabdha sin, and here that prarabdha sin is said to be negated by having performed this act of bhakti, because the status that you can get or the ineligibility that you have because of that sin is said to be negated. Therefore, bhakti destroys prarabdha sin, and that's the whole argument that he's trying to make. So let's look at one more comment here. Jiva Goswami explains what Rupa Goswami is trying to say as follows. Therefore, in regard to the mention of, quote, a low caste specifically, as the cause even in regard to ineligibility for savana, the meaning of, quote, a low caste is this caste, in this case, is a sinful birth unfavorable to eligibility for that. That is, a sinful birth that is a cause of non-eligibility for savana, and not rather a birth possessed only of the absence of eligibility for that, because of Brahmana boys having the requirement of the Savitra birth caused by a specific form of merit for the sake of attaining eligibility for savana, even in the absence of their low caste status in their seminal birth in the family of Brāhmaṇas. That is, a low caste refers not only to an absence of eligibility for savana, but to the disqualification from having any eligibility for savana, since even those born in eligible castes, such as the Brahmana caste, are also required to receive a second birth, the Savitra birth, to become eligible for performance of savana. Consequently, furthermore, even prarabdha sin, causative of the onset of having a low caste unfavorable for eligibility for savana, is certainly gone in the case described in the Bhagavad 3.33.6, wherein a dog eater is said to attain eligibility for savana. But there is no Savitra birth. That is, the dog eater spoken of in 3.33.6 does not actually receive a Savitra birth, meaning a second birth, on account of the non-existence of that in the conduct of the cultured. Okay, now this is the practical point. So he's talking about shishtachar. In other words, what do we observe in society? The Bhagavatam is saying this person is eligible for savana. Well, do we see in the established conduct of those learned in Shastra historically that anyone ever literally went and got the Upanayan Sanskar after chanting the name? No, we don't see that. This is Jiva Goswami talking in the 15 whatever it was that he wrote this. So in the 16th century, there was no such established conduct. So Jiva Goswami is saying that following Sridhar Swami's interpretation and observing in his society that there's no precedent for any application of another interpretation, he's giving weight to this conclusion that it doesn't literally refer to performing the act, but rather to the attainment of the respectability. So, because there has been no precedent found in the conduct of those conversant in Shastra for the dog-eaters spoken of in 333.6, or others like such a person, actually ever receiving a Savitra birth. Thus, for him, that is, for the dog-eater spoken of in the verse, there exists the requirement of another birth. So he's saying, that person who did the act of bhakti and acquired eligibility for savana, they have to be born again in order to get the Upanayan Sanskar, and then with the Upanayan Sanskar they could perform that yajna. Just as there is a requirement for Brahmana boys of a Savitra birth caused by a specific form of merit, negating of the absence of eligibility for savana. That is, since the Savitra birth is necessary for those born in a Brahmana family to become eligible for performance of savana, the dog cooker purified by bhakti described in this verse would need to be reborn in the family of an eligible varna, whereby he too could also receive this Savitra birth, and thus also become fully eligible for performance of savana. This is the purport. Therefore, even in the statement of evidence, meaning the aforesaid verse of the Bhagavad, it is evident that the phrase, quote, he becomes qualified for savana, savanaya kalpate, means he becomes considered qualified for performance of savana, and not rather that he can become a bearer of eligibility for performance of savana right then. Also, the explanation given by him, meaning Samipad, conveys this same conclusion. Quote, he becomes eligible for savana, that is for performing the Somayagya, by this statement that a dog cooker becomes eligible to perform the Somayaga, respectability is indicated. That is, the statement is not meant to be taken literally and imply that a dog cooker can or should actually attempt to learn and conduct a Somayaga. Okay, so I'll just read one more paragraph and we'll conclude. I know this is very technical and might seem like we're rehashing the same thing, but I just thought while we're getting into it, we could just give a full analysis of all the points that Jiva Goswami and the other commentators make, and then the matter is done, so to speak, or then we've exhausted the scope of conversation in terms of how to interpret what our acharyas say in this subject. So, Sri Divapad's explanation here, that, quote, there is no Savitra birth on account of the non-existence in the conduct of the cultured, meaning in the conduct of those adherent to Shastra, conveys that there is no precedent within the various Vaiṣṇava sampradayas, such as those established by Nimbarkacharya, Ramanujacharya, and Madhvacharya, that someone not born in the upper three varnas, who has most fortunately performed some act of bhakti, as described in 333.6, ever receives the Savitra birth, that is, becomes a twice-born and then conducts a Somayaga. The description in the verse, moreover, is not made with specific reference to whether the dog cooker mentioned in the verse has or has not received Vaiṣṇava Diksha. If the person referred to in the verse is assumed to have received Vaiṣṇava Diksha, then the person is to be considered a follower of the path of bhakti, and thus situated on a path that is categorically superior to the path of karma and all the observances contained within it, which includes receiving a Savitra birth, that is the Upanayan Sanskar, and performing the Somayaga. There is thus nothing to gain for such a Dikshita Vaishnava by receiving a Savitra birth and conducting a Somayaga. It should thus be understood that if a Dikshita Vaishnava who was born outside the three upper varnas were to accept a Savitra birth and adopt the various daily practices stipulated by it, there would be no benefit for them on the path of bhakti as a result of doing so. So what would you gain by less following the path of bhakti and now incorporating these practices from the path of karma into your daily sadhana? There wouldn't be any benefit from doing so, and moreover, rather, there would be detriment to their progress on the path of bhakti. So even we will argue that it hampers their progress on the path of bhakti. Why? Because their time and energy would be diverted from the path of bhakti, and they would be culpable of engaging in a practice that, what does it say? Would be culpable of engaging in practice, I think that just means that contravenes the established conduct of the cultured, aforementioned by Jiva Goswami, and honoring such conduct is a responsibility of those who follow the path of bhakti. So Rupa Goswami speaks of what he calls sadhu marganugamam, or following the path of the sat, following the path of the Mahajans. Mahajano janagata sapuntya. What is the way? It's the way by which the Mahajans have gone. So the Mahajans, the Shishta, the cultured, the great, they've never done this. There's no precedent for them doing this. So why would going off and doing that amount to following the path that they set? It wouldn't. It would be going off on another path. So as following the path of the sat is a practice of bhakti, going off of that path is contrary to the path of bhakti. It can result in disregard, or it can be considered, a type of disrespect to the Mahajans if you are aware of what they taught and then you decide to go off and do it differently. So you don't gain anything from doing it, and in one sense, you show disregard to the path that they've established by going off and doing something else. So in that way, there's really no benefit to the followers of the path of bhakti, or to a dikshita Vaiṣṇava, by taking up these practices from the path of karma. So, I've gone over my hour here. I'll have to stop here. But next, we'll consider the other side of it. What if the person is not a dikshita Vaiṣṇava? Then in their case, what would be the benefit of doing that? Or how would it be applied? That is the other possible scenario, if we want to examine all these possible scenarios. So we'll look at that next time. So in summary, we've presented commentaries of Sri Goswami, Jiva Gosvami, Vishnu Chakravarti, all explaining that this statement in the Bhagavatam implies that if you want, for whatever reason, should you so want, to perform a Soma Yaga, you'll need to take birth again in order to do so if you're not already born in a family from a caste that's considered eligible, according to the texts that stipulate all these rules. Now again, as I said at the beginning of this whole discussion, I'm not here to, promote or emphasize these things, or to look at, there might be a longer historical timeline in which these type of perspectives weren't present. We're looking at this through the lens of these particular commentators of the Gaudiya tradition and trying to understand how they saw it within their social context. And this is how they saw it. So, it'll go on for some time. We'll look at the comments also on the following verse in the Bhagavatam to understand in full what will be the implication of Kapila Dev's statement and how our commentators saw the practical application of the teachings given in this statement for persons following the path of bhakti, as well as for society in general. So, I stop here. If anyone has any comments, questions, corrections, or otherwise, please feel free. Yes, I see a hand.
I have 3 questions. I would like to just spell them out and then we can have some discussion. The first question is, Krishna Jiva Goswami in the 15th century states what we heard today. And the 16th century, Sakala says, yes, that the Vaiṣṇava who is eligible to perform Samayaga. And this is in Tika, Tika to Bhakti-rasa. He approves that, yes, he doesn't need to take an expert. He is eligible to do it at this point. Next question. Regarding Vanashrama, is promoting Vanashrama to Vaiṣṇavas is the kind of Vaiṣṇava jāti buddhi, right? Whether it's actually offense to make judgment on starting for Vaiṣṇava or Vaiṣṇava starting for Vaiṣṇava. And third question: what's the difference between Smarta Brahmana and Brahmana? Is there a difference between Smarta and Brahmana? Because there's some strong statement against Smarta Brahmanas, Jiva Gosvami. So I thought maybe there's a difference between Brahmanas and Smarta Brahmanas. I mean, there's 3 questions. So back to if you would say, if you can remember.
Okay, I'll try. The audio was a bit rough, so I'm not sure if I properly heard everything, but I'll try to reply. If I understood properly, the first question was about Vishnu Chakravarti's comments on this verse that he gives in regard to the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. So that comment I will address in the next class. That comes in our discussion a little ways ahead, because he gives a second interpretation where he differs from his own interpretation that I presented today in the Sarita Darshini. So why does Vishnu Chakravarti give this second interpretation, where he'd already agreed with Jiva Gosvami, and then in this other interpretation he gives another view? That is precisely something we'll discuss in the next class, and we'll examine exactly what Vishnu Chakravarti has to say. So I think we can dive fully into that next time. The second question was, or was it the third? The difference between a Brahman and a Smarta Brahmana.
Yeah. Whether Vaishnava, establishing Vaishnava Dharma in Vaishnava society would be kind of ninda towards, implying Vaishnava Jati Buddhi, making judgment, oh, you're from this Varna, you're from that Varna, you're lower, you're higher, but actually Vaishnava is established above Brahmanas, so why to bring them into Vaishnava system, Varnashrama system?
I think it would depend on the mentality of the person. In other words, it could be a type of Jati Buddhi if some persons who were steeped in the conventional thinking of the Varnashram society just came along and said, well, let's just make all of you follow this, and then, didn't show regard to the purifying benefit of Vaishnavatva, then that would definitely be, the application of, or the non-respecting of the transcendental power of Vaishnavatva or of bhakti, which would be a type of aparad to bhakti. But if the motivation is not to disrespect bhakti, but rather to try to provide a social system or produce a greater degree of social cohesion to support the practice of bhakti, in other words, if the person's mentality wasn't that bhakti isn't transcendental to this, but that even in the midst of the culture of bhakti, there would be value to having this varna vyavastha, or this society organized by these principles, if they were thinking along those lines and they were trying to reinstitute these things, I would just say that that's complicated. In other words, the whole way that it's designed from the scripture is that it comes from birth, and it's something that's descended from the kind of ahistorical beginning of time, from the Purush, these things just exist. So there isn't really a way to kind of start it at a point in time. And so the idea that, well, we'll just analyze people's qualities and then throw them into all these categories, that also isn't actually described in the scripture anywhere as a method for doing that. There isn't actually any, that I've ever seen in any of the texts, a way to sort of establish the Varnashram society in a place that it's not. It's usually just regarded as this kind of Sanatana Dharma, or this beginningless, ever-present custom. So as soon as you want to now kind of recreate it, you're necessarily on some uncharted waters, so to speak, or, you're now, doing something that's going to require some novelty that you don't have a direct injunction for. So how exactly you want to go about that, I'll leave it up to the people who might harbor those kind of ambitions to do so. That's not, I personally don't see that that's an imperative by any means. When we look at things through the lens of the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, the Sandarbhas, the Hari Bhakti Vilas, we can see that the culture of bhakti can go on just fine, whether that, the presence of those varnas is there in society or not, in an organized manner or not. There's no real necessity for those, for persons to follow the path of bhakti. So if they remain to some extent in the society, then let them be respected according to convention. If they're absent, then, in my personal opinion, move in accord with what is, conducive to the social circumstances one is in, and, proceed as per what is most favorable to the cultivation of bhakti. And, let how society as a whole is to be organized and governed, I would say leave that to the people whose principal concern is that. Persons who, are examining and applying all the complexity of that with all the, relevant information, ancient and modern. That's an extremely complex project. So, to think that, some Vaishnav theorists can, simply based on, some statements in these texts, kind of redesign the whole society without any regard for all the different, cultural customs, all the different philosophies, all the different discoveries, all the different sensibilities that have emerged over the course of hundreds of years, and all the diversity in that. For me, that's a bit reckless. And, I think the wisdom of these other cultures and the knowledge that's also been acquired by other means, that also should be integrated into any serious attempt to organize and guide a present-day society. And that is something that's very complex and requires expertise in many fields. And I think if some Vaishnavas are inspired to contribute to social policy and so forth, then, good. If that's how they want to spend their life and energy and focus, but let them do so in consultation with others who have, a great deal of knowledge and expertise in that in a responsible manner. And I would consider it just a bit reckless to kind of go with a simplistic Puranic model and try to, kind of force fit that onto modern society. I don't foresee that that'll be, accepted anytime soon, or that it'll be able to adjust to the complexity and diversity found in modern day society in a way that will really serve to bring about the common good in a conventional sense. And as I said, for those following the path of bhakti, it's not essential anyway. But that's just my personal opinion, and I don't want to discourage those who may have the wish to do that. If they want to, then sure, let them try.
Yeah. So another one, what's the difference between smarta Brāhmaṇas and Brāhmaṇas? Because Jiva Gosvami spoke very harshly about the smarta Brāhmaṇas. Jiva Gosvami spoke quite harshly about smarta Brāhmaṇas. So what is the difference between smarta Brāhmaṇas and Brāhmaṇas? Is there any?
No, I mean, I perhaps you could say a Brahman in general is defined as, the definitions that we gave earlier. And then if, as a Brahmana, they have a pointed focus upon the Smriti Shastra and don't take to the path of bhakti, or don't take to some of the other paths that Brahmanas may, you also have Shakta Brahmanas or Shaiva Brahmanas or persons like that, but persons who don't take to any of those type of practices, but are, you could say, strongly riveted on Smriti Shastra, they might be distinguished as, quote, smarta Brahmanas in comparison to Brahmanas in general, although I would say that's a loose distinction, not a sharp distinction. And the point that Sanatana Gosvami made about these, quote, envious smarta Brahmanas, just for clarification, I would say he's not referring to all Brahmanas who follow the smartas as necessarily being envious, but that among Brahmanas who are specifically focused on Smriti Shastra, then he's saying a group of them, might have been motivated or ill-motivated in fabricating some statements to put forward their cause, but not necessarily that all Brahmanas who are focused on Smriti Shastra are such.
Okay, yeah, thank you. That's clear. Thank you.
All right. Well, maybe we can leave it at that for today. I commend you all for your patience in dealing with all these technicalities.
Thank you. Nice.
For those who are interested or, care, it might be, all these little details might be interesting. For others, it might seem like a lot of technical analysis. But anyway, it's not too much longer, but the point that you brought up just now, this why Chakravarti Pod gives this additional alternate interpretation, is another kink, if you will, in discussing this whole subject. So we'll definitely give due attention to that, and some other relevant points in this respect as we get near the end of this subject matter. So more on this next time. Vaiṣṇavebhyo Namo Namah. Jai Shri Guru, Jai Shri Gaur, Jai Jai Radhe Shyam.
Jai Radhe Shyam.
Jai Shri Radhe.
Thank you.